Welcome to the Evolving Performance Podcast. Today I'm excited to welcome Bill Hartman as a guest on the podcast. Bill is a world-renowned physical therapist and a co-owner, along with Mike Robertson, who was previously on the podcast, of Indianapolis Fitness and Sports Training, or IFAST, which was recognized by Men's Health as one of the top 10 gyms in America. Bill's lifelong pursuit of self-improvement and efforts to continue pushing the fitness, performance, and rehab industries forward led him to creating the Unified Health and Performance Continuum model, which is a principles-based reasoning framework for understanding and improving human movement. It expands upon traditional views by reconstructing movement from a first principles perspective, grounded in science and human physiology. Rather than focusing only on muscles and joints as separate parts, the UHPC model looks at how the entire human system, both internal and external, works together to manage forces, distribute stress, and create movement in response to the demands placed upon it. Bill is an in-demand speaker and consultant across the country and around the world to share his model and approach to restoring a pain-free lifestyle to other health and fitness professionals. He regularly mentors physical therapy students and interns, many of whom have gone on to land positions in professional sport or become successful business owners themselves. In this episode, we discuss structural biases and how they contribute to an athlete's potential to develop and express speed or strength, the trade-offs of training, and how failing to recognize an individual's structural archetype or their build can cause training to have a negative impact on performance, practical suggestions for altering exercise selection for athletes training in different environments, how Bill evaluates breathing, and why quote-unquote belly breathing is a poor representation of diaphragm function, and using movement evaluations in individuals that don't present with pain. Before we dive in, I want to thank our sponsor, Metabolic Elite. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know I'm a huge fan of Metabolic Elite. The company was founded by James Laval, who is an internationally recognized clinical pharmacist and board-certified clinical nutritionist, to provide supplements and education to help support the health, performance, and recovery of high performers. Each product is formulated using research-supported ingredients and dosages using the highest quality ingredients, so you can be confident that every product you take will deliver the maximal benefit and effect. In the past, I've discussed the benefits of one of my favorite products called Synapsin, which has significant benefits for focus, mental processing, and decision-making, areas of cognition that will not only have an impact on sport performance, but are also beneficial for anyone navigating busy schedules, experiencing poor sleep, or changing time zones. Today, I want to highlight one of my other favorite products, Enduro 2. Enduro 2 uses a compound from rhodiola, which has long been recognized as a powerful adaptogen that improves exercise performance and the body's ability to adapt to stress. The specific active compound is called salidroside, and it has been shown in a placebo-controlled study to improve oxygen utilization during high-intensity exercise and to reduce muscle damage following resistance training. It does this through several different mechanisms that promote improved glucose utilization, mitochondrial function, and oxygen transport, as well as reducing inflammation and sparing glycogen, which is the body's carbohydrate stores that support high-intensity efforts. On a personal note, I've experimented with taking Enduro 2 before several hard, high-intensity interval conditioning days where I can actually track my output, and my pace is consistently higher after taking Enduro 2 compared to days when I don't. It's rare for a supplement to have an immediate and significant impact on performance and reduce the recovery cost of that output in terms of minimizing muscle damage, which is why Enduro 2 is such a powerful option to improve both training and game performance. I've been taking Metabolic Elite supplements for over a year now, and one of the cool things about the line is that many of the products are made using a liposomal tablet delivery system, which is just a chewable tablet. The LPT technology significantly improves the bioavailability of the supplement, or how much of the product is actually available for your body to use, and the chewable tablets are really easy to take for people that don't like swallowing pills. There's a lot of great information about Metabolic Elite's products, the LPT technology, and other important tips to help you optimize your performance on their website. So go check out metabolicelite.co. That's metabolicelite.co, and you can save 15% off all products using the code NEELD15. That's NEELD15 to save 15%. Now please welcome Bill Hartman to the podcast. Bill, it's great to have you on. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. It has been forever. And so I was looking forward to this for quite a while.
It's great. I think, over the last several years, you've shared a lot of information about how an individual's structural biases allow them to be more successful in certain activities compared to others. And, I think we all see that. You can look at things like offensive linemen in football or swimmers, and you see very similar body types across people that are competing at the highest levels. So, maybe the best place to start here is, can you describe some of the structural biases that may allow somebody to be, more naturally fast, and contrast that with somebody that's more naturally strong?
Okay. Well, we should probably define fast. So if we're talking about running speed, that's a little bit different than talking about, say, arm velocity in a baseball pitcher. Their arm's going at 9,000 degrees per second. And if we're just talking about somebody that can cover some ground very, very quickly, all we have to do is start looking at, the best of the best. And so if you look at Olympic athletes, you're going to see very well-defined structures because there is a favorable representation of structure in all of those events. You look at the sprinters, they're going to fall within, with minor exceptions. They're going to fall within a certain body type. If you had a shot putter standing next to a sprinter, I think you could probably tell the difference between the two, right? I think everybody sees that, but maybe they don't recognize the fact that those structures are not a byproduct of the training. It is the fact that this person gravitated towards this element of sport because their structure was ideal for it. You brought up the swimmer thing. It's like, and I've said this on a number of occasions, but if you watch Olympic swimming and they do the little intro thingy, where they pan the camera down the line, and it's like if they didn't have different color swim caps on with their flag on it, so you knew where they were from, you probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart because their structures are so similar. Because for that event, there is a very specific body type that is ideal. I want this sort of like a triangular kind of a shape with these wide shoulders, small waist, and I wouldn't want heavy legs as a swimmer. And so they're structurally designed to float. They've got a lot of surface area when they're on the water. They want to keep their body in the densest part of the water, which is that interface between the air and the water. And there's a certain body type that's going to allow that to happen. You're going to have longer limbs, they're going to have bigger hands, they're going to have bigger feet, et cetera, because it promotes the ideal result. And so it doesn't matter what event or what sport that we're talking about, there's going to be a bias towards structure. If we have somebody that's fast now, so if we're talking about, again, running speed, so you think about like, okay, well, what body type allows me to stay in the air longer? Because I know that if I can apply force over a very, very short period of time and then stay in the air longer, I am faster. And so this is what I would refer to the funnel configuration, where you have, again, the wider shoulders and smaller waist, because the energetic bias is upward, the pressure bias is upward, and so that allows people to stay in the air longer, which contributes to their ability to run very, very fast. If you're talking about just force production, like absolute force production without a time constraint, then you want a structure that you could put a bunch of weight on, which, again, from a configuration, this is going to be somebody that's going to be shaped like a pillar. It's like, so I won't see the same tapering of structure. I would see something that would have more of a similar diameter throughout that structure, because it is a higher force structure. It's less efficient as far as running across the ground, but it's also a higher pressure structure. And this is like simple, crazy physics. You talk about the lift that picks up a car. It's like the way that system works is like I have this really heavy cylinder that provides a lot of pressure, and that's ultimately what is able to lift the car. And so I'm going to see this similarity. This is why you would see like you mentioned the offensive lineman in football. It's like, well, they have a very specific jobs. It's like take two steps, get in a really aggressive wrestling match for about 6 seconds, and then repeat. And so if I need somebody that can cover ground very quickly over a short distance, but then needs to apply hard force, I'm going to have a very specific structure. I also want a structure that doesn't move as well. So I now have the immovable object. So I need something that has a great deal of density, a great deal of downforce. So number one, they can apply force to another human, but they also can resist a great amount of force. And so again, the structural biases just follow the context. And so you'll see that across the board. There's always exceptions to the rule because everything that we talk about is multifactorial. But when you think about absolute foundations, it's like if I don't have the structure and for me to perform at a high level in an event where I may not be ideal, I have to have another element within my capacities that would allow me to overcome that structural bias.
So I want to circle back to the exceptions in a minute here, but if somebody's listening and, you mentioned the funnel configuration, the pillar configuration, I've heard you talk about wides and narrows, and obviously there's now a continuum that, you can kind of discuss the outer limits of that. And, a ton of people are going to exist somewhere in between those. What do you use as your audit to determine, where somebody's structural bias is? So, somebody listening, if they're thinking like, well, which one of these describes my structure more, and, what might be the impact on the movement stereotypes or the movement strategies that I'll be more successful with?
Okay, so you have to picture a cylinder with a helical reinforcing structure. So a spiral structure that would spiral down, and you've got two of them that would wrap around this entire structure. And that's how we are designed. And so based on the angle of those helices relative to the long axis. So if we use the axial skeleton as our frame, we've got an axis that goes straight down through our head and right down through the bottom of the pelvis. So relative to that angle would determine how wide our structure would be or narrow, depending on the case may be. So if we have 8 billion people all over the world, there's going to be two people that stand out. One's going to be the most extreme narrow person that we've ever seen, and one's going to be the extreme wide. And then we have this broad spectrum that would fall in between, but we would all be biased on one side of that theoretical middle that probably doesn't even exist in most circumstances, because they wouldn't be really good at anything. So we wouldn't even talk about them. So everybody's going to have and I strongly use the word bias because what these biases indicate are probabilistic tendencies and behaviors, and there are few absolutes as far as what an outcome could be produced, but again, that we fall back on the structural foundation, and this allows us to identify this. Well, what is this person's tendencies going to be? Because there are certain behaviors that would follow that gives us a greater chance at being successful when applying an intervention to produce a specific outcome, whether it be health related, like recapturing relative motion, or producing some sort of performance related outcome. And so you could literally, by using the helical structure, that's how we would identify. So I have referenced what I would refer to as a wide helical archetype and a narrow helical archetype. I mean, we'll abbreviate those with wide ISA and narrow ISAs for discussion purposes. But essentially, you have again tendencies to how much movement they would have. They would have a bias. One would have a bias towards external rotation, which would be like your narrow helical archetype, and another would be biased towards more internal rotation, which would be your wide helical archetype. And we have tests, and the reason that I abbreviate this to narrow ISA and wide ISA is because we have this helical representation that gives us this foundational representation, and that's the way that the lower rib cage meets the sternum, and it gives us a nice frame to allow us to make effective decisions based on structure. And so we would use that as our primary indicator as to how someone might be structured, with the understanding that, again, multifactorial behaviors, we're going to have other influences, but from a strength of reference, that's the one that I would recommend, because it gives us the best chance of being accurate. And then it becomes a within subjects design experiment in all cases, where I'm going to do something based on this person's theoretical tendencies. I have to recognize what that outcome is, and then that allows me to make the next step in the process.
I think that last point, Bill, is one that I've certainly taken from you over the years, and one that probably gets underappreciated when I hear, the whisper down the lane attempted teachings at some of the messages that you've conveyed. And, I think the ability to have some sort of assessment process to look at an anticipated or maybe hopeful outcome, but then to be humble enough and aware enough of the process to recognize when it doesn't go according to plan, and then to have another route to go to. That's one of the big messages I've taken from you, is to not assume you're going to get some outcome, and then probably, more problematically, not just assume that you'll get it, but ignore it when you don't, and continue down a path that isn't leading to successful outcomes.
Right. We're playing with probabilities. So this is like playing poker. This is not something that is constrained like playing chess, which is very objective. Now, certainly there's strategy involved with chess, but it is like, they're not going to throw extra squares on the board, and you're not going to get new pieces, and they're not going to change the rules in the middle of the game. So we're always trying to manage the probabilities in our favor, because you're dealing with a complex adaptive system, which means that you do not know what the outcome is going to be. The better you get at making a judgment and influence to structure and behaviors and then recognizing outcomes, you shift the probabilities more in your favor. There's always, people say, well, when was the last time you failed? And I said, well, what did I do yesterday? Because I'm sure I failed at some point yesterday. Because again, you just can't predict how this level of complexity is going to turn out. But we have a process. And again, I'm not using the word experiment, loosely here. It is an experiment, because you just don't know what the outcome's going to be. But the outcome then helps you determine the next thing to do, which is
it seems that seems pretty far away from my introduction into injury rehabilitation, which was, whatever the injury is, you find that sheet in the binder, and
you look it up. Here's the
MCL
protocol.
rehab phase 1.
Yeah, exactly. There'll be commonalities. There'll be commonalities in those situations, but what are you going to do when it does fail? And it's like, you can't go to, I just did number 3, that didn't work, I'm going to go to number 4. It's like, it just doesn't work that way.
Do you, just leaning into that idea a little bit, do you find that there are any underlying explanations for why an intervention may fail?
Man, it's like, where do you start? It could be, okay, so my room that I work in is purple. And it's not purple because I like purple. It's purple because it has an effect. And like, my walls used to be this horrible rusty brown, and you could just feel the stress as you walked into this room. And so we started painting the walls a different color, and hey, the outcomes get better. But it could be any number of things. It could be the words that I use. It could be the position that I select, which is inappropriate. It could be a lack of understanding between my brain and the other person's brain that I'm working with. It's like, maybe they just don't have that movement vocabulary to understand exactly what I want them to do. And so there's any number of places. Again, because this is so complex and so multifactorial, there could be any number of places where the failure exists. The goal is to try to be as consistent, and then debriefing yourself on a like constantly. I think one of the mistakes that people make when they are successful is they don't ask any questions. They make an assumption that they did the right thing, rather than asking the exact same questions that you would ask yourself if you had failed in a scenario. It's like, well, what did I do? What do I think happened? Why do I think this happened? What else could I have done differently? Even in the face of success, it's like, what could I have done differently that may have even provided a better outcome? It's constantly asking yourself. It's like Socratic questioning. It's like, why? Like, ask yourself why about 5 times every time you see an outcome, not necessarily successful or unsuccessful, but it's challenging yourself to recognize as much as you possibly can. You start mixing this down, within whatever system that you're applying, and then the scenarios start to become familiar. And then you say, oh, last time I saw this, I did this and I got this outcome. I'm going to experiment, safely. I'm not going to put anybody at risk. I'm going to experiment safely. I'm going to do the same thing and see what happens. And then the more I get a consistent outcome in such a scenario, then I can start to say, okay, there's something about what I'm doing here in this scenario that is favorable. And then it's again, trying to resolve over and over again, what is it that is making the greatest impact? Is it the way that I talk? Is it the like you take somebody's foot and you put it in a certain space in a certain context so they get a sensation? It's like, maybe that's the sensation. Maybe it's the exercise. It's like, I think the big challenge is to avoid patting yourself on the back when you're successful and just making the assumption that, oh, I did everything right. Consider that you get a good outcome, favorable outcome. Everybody's happy. Like, clients happy because they feel better, but it's like, maybe I could have done something that was even better. And I think we got to keep challenging ourselves to do that.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, we touched earlier a little bit on, you can collect the information and make what at the time seems like the best decision and have a less than desirable outcome on the back end. I imagine the opposite is also true, that you can make a questionable decision up front and still have a favorable outcome on the back end. And those may be a little bit harder to naturally want to self-appraise and assess, what happened, because the outcome was where you wanted it.
Yeah. What we're talking about is the value of experience, right? It's like, people think that they need more knowledge and more information. It's like, we got all the information, like, we're getting really close to having all the information we could possibly acquire at this point. And, but I think that the experiential element gets undervalued. People says, they just think that, oh, I need to take the next course, or I need to read the next book. And by all means do that, because it's going to provide you a much larger toolbox and expand your frame of reference, but it's the execution that matters, and it's not whether the deepest of science in that circumstance. It's like, well, how many times have you seen something similar in this context? And then how many times were you successful, or you just throwing stuff at them and hoping that it
I'm reminded of a quote, and I'll paraphrase here, that and somebody says, like, I have 20 years of experience, and the question is, do you have 20 years of experience, or do you have 1 year of experience repeated 20 times? And I think the self-reflection process that you outlined is a big part of making sure that the longevity actually results in experience and not just reinforced assuuments. I want to circle back to the exceptions idea that you alluded to earlier. So thinking back to running speed, you said funnel configuration would lend itself to faster running speeds. Force more pillar configuration. Just to get ahead of this, I think obviously there are probably pillar bias configurations that also can run fast relative to their structure. There are some funnel configurations that can also produce a lot of force relative to their structure. What are some of the qualities that may cause someone to be an exception to the expected outputs relative to their structural architecture?
So if you construct an event, so top speed sprinting, so here's what we know. I need to apply a very high level of vertical force in the shortest time possible. So if you look at an elite sprinter, it's going to be somewhere between 0.08 and 0.11 seconds of ground contact time. So if I can hit that, and I can magnify the force that's being applied within that time frame, I'm faster. And so if I take somebody that might not have the ideal configuration, but they have the capacity to apply this ridiculously high force within that window, then they will get faster. And so this is what you would consider like working within one athlete, and say they're not designed, as we would say, for the prototypical sprinter that falls within a certain height range, a certain body mass, and a certain physical structure. They're a little bit more, like, again, biased towards this high force kind of a structure. But if I can train them to apply this force over a shorter period of time, I've just made my athlete faster. So again, the higher the level of performance, you're going to see you're going to see the structure gravitate. It would be very rare that we would see a very stocky 5'5" male sprinter that would, win a gold medal in the Olympics. It would be a very rare occasion. It's not impossible. It's just very rare because, again, it's like we're looking at structural selection under those circumstances. And so I think, it's not that everybody can't get faster to some measurable degree. It's just we have to take in a structural consideration. If I have a less than ideal structure, then I have to start playing with the other factors that are the influence. It's like, okay, can I increase their rate of force application in this circumstance? Can I keep it within that very, very narrow window? And they would have an individualized success. They might not be world class or whatever, but maybe at a lower level qualification, they are successful, and maybe that's satisfactory. Or if it's within a sport itself, now they start to see this carry over into their specific sports performance. So I tend to look at these things as individualistic as we can, rather than making like this absolute comparison that, oh, you have a structure that's designed for strength, you'll never get faster, kind of a thing. It's like I would never think along those lines. I would say, how can I take this structure and now I can work within what these other elements that are within the context that we're behaving. It's like, how can I manipulate those for the favorable outcome?
Yet in some of those situations, you may not be pursuing speed, you might be pursuing less slow, which, is
there
still,
you go. I like that. That's
right
good.
direction.
You're less slow today. That's nice.
I guess to piggyback off that, Bill, I'm curious how much can these structural biases be altered? And, you brought up the wide ISA, narrow ISA as representations of, the broader helical because of some layered compensation and vice versa. So, to what extent are you able to make changes in some of these factors?
Okay, so we have a genetically determined structural bias. And then from that, if we understand like the principles of how we actually apply force, for instance, we're not changing the foundational structure. What we're doing is we're going to superimpose something upon that structure. So a narrow ISA is always going to be a narrow ISA. A wide ISA is going to be a wide ISA. Wide ISAs would be balanced or structurally predetermined for higher force. And then the narrows would be more like a velocity-based kind of a thing. It's generally a lower pressure system. But I could train a narrow ISA and teach them how to compress their structure, which would increase the force application. Now, there's consequences to that. So, and if you just think about squeezing somebody front to back like a tube of toothpaste, right? So if I squeeze the front of you and the back of you, there would be a resultant downward force that would arise. And again, that becomes our high force production. But in doing so, we're manipulating how the volume within the body can move. So we're creating gradients of pressure and volume. The consequence of that, though, is potentially taking away a measure that would be either related to health. So we would be reducing the relative movement of extremities in that circumstance, potentially, depending on the magnitude of change. So we're not changing their foundational structure. What we're doing is we're manipulating how we use that structure to produce the desired outcome. But the thing you have to be really, really careful of is like when you get to the point of like, well, how strong is strong enough? Well, strong enough is when you can maximize. I want everybody to have the capability to maximize their force production in a certain circumstance. But if I take, use a baseball pitcher since we brought it up before, if I raise the force producing capabilities of a baseball pitcher through a compressive strategy and I sacrifice shoulder range of motion, that's probably not going to be the desirable outcome overall. So we have to be aware of key performance indicators that need to be maintained for the ultimate force production. So I take my pitcher into the weight room and we're doing deadlifts and back squats and pressing and such. And we start to see the gym numbers go up. We go, okay, great. But what did we sacrifice to get there, if anything? And again, so we have to be very, very careful about how we do these things.
you brought up a great point that I wanted to transition to next anyway, which is just the potentially negative impact that training can have on an athlete's performance.
Yeah.
And, I think traditionally athletes are told, I need to get faster, I need to get bigger, I need to get stronger.
Right.
And when you hear those goals, there's, kind of a catalog of potential solutions that kind of pop into your head. I need to get faster. I can drag sleds and run sprints and do some jump work and things along those lines. Like I need to get bigger, stronger. I'm lifting heavier weights. And, traditionally there are certain exercises, even within resistance training, that are more commonly used for that purpose. And, this idea that there's a cost or, a potentially undesirable consequence of that selection process is probably underappreciated. Can you expand on that?
Well, there's always a consequence, right? And so then we have to determine whether it is a desirable consequence or not, right? So again, just seeing that, like, if someone's, and they'll refer to as strength, but we want to, clarify that this is force production. It's like, if I increase someone's force producing capabilities and then expand the window upon which that they need to apply that force to produce that outcome, but then the window of opportunity within the specific context, within the specific sport, it's like I've just wasted that force because it's not even usable in that circumstance. And so now I have this higher force producing athlete, but now I've actually slowed them down, or I stuck them to the ground by accident because the amount of time it takes for them to actually recognize that force is not helpful. And then the following that, we go into the secondary consequences of the loss of motion. It's like, okay, well, what if I need this motion to protect myself within my sport, right? In a decelerative behavior, and I no longer have that. And so now I have somebody that can't decelerate the system. They're going to continue to move too quickly through a space. And now I have to compromise structure in that circumstance. So I end up with anything from hamstring strains to sprained ankles to twisted knees to, again, sacrificing a structure like a labrum or a rotator cuff or a medial elbow, or take your pick.
So, I'm thinking of athletes that are in a team sport environment, or, kind of the typical college setting, or even performance professionals that are working in that setting that have some logistical constraints with the number of athletes that are coming through their doors at one point. In situations where, maybe somebody can't completely overhaul exercise selection, but they could make some adjustments to how they're performing a given exercise. Do you have suggestions on, are there situations where it's like, okay, do the same exercise because you can't change it, but stay lighter and emphasize the velocity? Or, I want you to change your stance to, allow for less of the negative secondary consequences of, can you give a couple examples on strategies that may be appropriate there?
Sure. Okay. So because we have structural biases, we also have a tendency to have a bias towards a greater magnitude of external rotation versus internal rotation, for instance. So narrow ISAs would have their bias towards external rotation, higher velocity. Wide ISAs, less velocity, higher force, more internal rotation. So this is more straight down force application in that circumstance. And it's not that if we had two athletes with different structures that we wouldn't want them to both have capacities in both aspects. But if you think about somebody that would be biased towards more of an externally rotated activity, and I'm trying to put them into a position to push straight down into the ground, it's like, okay, so they don't actually push as straight down into the ground as somebody with the wider structure. And so just selecting a different stance might be appropriate under that circumstance. So I might use just a width of a stagger within an activity itself can adapt to their structural bias and allow them to still be successful and take something away that's going to transfer to their context. And so those are actually fairly simple adjustments to make. If you had somebody that would be again, narrow versus wide in pressing, and you think about the helices. So I have a wide helix on a wide ISA, and I have a more narrow helix on the narrow ISA. And if you think about just like a pressing activity in that circumstance, well, who do you think is going to have a more vertically oriented path for the extremity to move into? And it's like, up. So external rotation is up and out. And so it would be more of a vertical press. If I was to like give you a for instance, it's like your wider ISAs are going to be better bench pressers. Your narrow ISAs are going to be on more of the vertical. So like landmine pressing, overhead pressing, they tend to be a little bit more capable. Not that they both can't be strong, but I would point you towards like strongman. If you look at strongman, and you'll see like these really shorter, thicker, wider guys, and then you see the really tall guys that tend to have this because they do a lot of vertical pressing in strongman, and you'll see the differences in strategy associated with their ability to move a weight overhead. And because the helical angle is more in line with the vertical, the taller, narrower guys tend to be really, really good with overhead pressing. Whereas you'll see the shorter, wider guys, when they try to go overhead, they kind of have to sort of approximate themselves into this sort of like a horizontal position where you're going to see a lot more spinal orientation to allow them to put the load on their helix, because our greatest excursion of motion occurs on the helix and our greatest application of force occurs on that helix as well. And so we just have to account for those differences. It's a fairly easy thing to modify once you understand what kind of a structure that you're working with, because again, if we're trying to maximize the force output, we want to keep them on those helices as much as we can.
Bill, can you speak to the time course that some of these changes take place in? And I'm thinking, we get somebody that maybe has a wide, the American football offensive lineman that is built to not be moved.
Right.
That now finds themselves playing in a rotational sport where they need to spin a little bit more effectively. And, obviously my bias is my experience, and a lot of my background is in ice hockey. And, there's definitely some commonalities in the structures that we see in ice hockey, but we do see a bandwidth where, we get some guys that are a little wider and more compressed front to back, like you referenced. We get some others that are, your more traditional narrows that, move through a tighter rotation pretty efficiently. And, not always, but occasionally the flatter, wider archetypes are the ones that struggle with certain aspects of skill work, that becomes a point of emphasis. And if we get somebody that's in a situation like that, they've reached a stage of their career where, their outputs are at a level that allows them to be successful. And now there's a limitation in movement capacity and their ability to execute skills that require that movement capacity. What's a reasonable starting point for, if we're doing things in the right direction, we should expect to see some positive changes?
Well, okay, when we say positive changes, now we have to define that, because we have performance-related outcomes and then we have health-related consequences that we have to consider, right? So if I have typically your wide ISAs, and again, this just literally has to do with the ability to turn. If you look at, the old figure skater thingy at the end of every figure skater's performance, where they do the little spin at the end and they start really slow with their arms out and then they pull them in, they're pulling themselves towards a long axis, which allows them to increase the spinning velocity. So if I'm out wider, I tend to turn slower. The concern that we have in this circumstance is that if I do have somebody that has a structure that has a reduced capability of turning, is like they're going to have to use some form of compensatory strategy, because what they're going to acquire is a space to turn into. And the way that they do that is by bending structure. So whether we're talking about a baseball pitcher or a golfer or a hockey player, they're going to create space if they have the capacity to do so. They're going to create space by bending a spine that creates more space for them to turn into. They're going to bend a rib cage that's going to create more space for them to turn into. They're going to bend an extremity that will allow them to turn. So, if you see a hockey player with this progressive increase over time of say a bowing of the leg, which you will see over an extended period of time, they're looking for a space to turn. You're looking at a system that is either losing its capacity to turn and then creating a substitution, or never had the capacity, and then that's how they actually create the turn. Now, within a certain range, they will remain adaptable enough that they can maintain health, but then you have the consequence of sort of crossing that threshold. The concern that you have there is that you don't know where that threshold is, and that's why you have to monitor these things over an extended period of time. This is why you collect data. And then so you can say, Joe Bob's knee range of motion is slowly changing. He is like 10 degrees less than he was last season. And then you have to surmise as to, okay, well, what strategy is he actually using now that he didn't use before? And then you resolve, it's like, okay, well, where did we lose motion that we are trying to gain it through a structural adaptation? That's the biggest concern that we always have, because we have extremely high performers that use structural compensation to produce outcomes. And the longer that goes, well, our structure has limitations as to how much tolerance they might have before we have a failure in that circumstance.
And, I think this is probably true on a different scale for everybody, but, with athletes, there's aspects of their sport that they're more reactive to and they're responding to from a movement dynamic standpoint. And then there's, the very controllable movement strategies that, in our case, off the ice, you have a lot, there's less circumstances environmentally that they're responding to. You have a little bit more control over what you're asking them to do and how you're asking them to move or position themselves. Do you find that, and again, this is probably an unfair question, but do you find that, when you're delivering an intervention that that people are starting to make changes in a positive direction, within like a week or two, or is it more, how do you get it to stick where it's something that, they're making a positive change it then is hitting a threshold where it's becoming part of them. It's not just going to backslide after.
This is actually very clear. So we have state dependent constraints, and then we have structural constraints. State dependent constraints change instantly. So we can recapture relative motion within a joint, say for instance, instantaneously, if the reason for the constraint falls into this state dependence. So this is an increase in muscle activity that would be associated with a specific movement behavior. When we have a structural adaptation, you'll see like a femur that will be internally rotated at the knee and the tibia will be externally rotated at the knee. You'll see this a lot actually in your sport because of the ER demand. But you'll see that, and then we can actually have changes in bony shape that are adaptive to provide space for movement or an application of downforce. And so if it is a structural adaptation, now we're talking about a longer term adaptation. So if I bring somebody into the purple room, there's certain elements that I expect to change within that session, hopefully, right? That's the intention. And then if we identify this as, okay, so I have literally the shape of a tibia, the shape of a femur, the shape of the pelvis. If that is adaptive to acquire a certain outcome, those changes are going to take a long time. So if I broke a bone, that's 6 to 8 weeks, right? Now, for me to change the shape of a bone, I need to apply a sufficient stress in the right direction to produce the desired outcome without interference, which means the sport or with the training. And so then that makes it a little bit more difficult, and that's going to extend the range. So we have these things that we can change instantaneously. And then again, the more it becomes a structural adaptation, the longer you're talking about adaptation. If we were talking about hypertrophy or force producing capabilities, and you've probably seen this, is like you got this 4 to 6 week window where this program is going to be effective over that time frame, and then beyond that they start to stall out. They start to get stale with that type of program, which is why you just need to make a change to continue with the level of stimulation. And it's like, so if I'm trying to influence a structural adaptation, and this is the assumption that I have no other interference, like I control their world, then you're looking at weeks to make some of these structural adaptations, all measurable by following your key performance indicators to make sure that you're on the right path. And so this is, again, collecting data so you can have some probabilistic control over when these changes are taking place, how long it's going to take.
So you've brought up the idea of having KPIs that you use to, self-audit your process. And, I realize that some of those will be directed by the person sitting in front of you and the amount of time and consistency that you may be able to see somebody. But what are some of your big rocks in that area, Bill, as far as, somebody flies in to see you in the purple room, where are you starting that evaluation process with them?
I don't really distinguish too much between diagnoses or like event or anything along those lines, because I'm trying to look at the human for what it is. And they're going to kind of tell you, it's like, well, here's the strategy that I like to use. And this shows up in like, so we're taking this full panel of total body ranges of motion. And that actually allows you to distinguish where they like to position their center of gravity, what strategy that they're using. And in doing so, how is this affecting all of your peripheral measures and then your axial capabilities? So we can sort of create this 3D printout, if you will, of how their structure is behaving, at least in that moment. And we're going to make the assumption that this is going to be either a trained tendency, behavioral associated with the context of their sport, or it's going to fall back on foundational structure. And so we take those elements into consideration. And then that's how we determine the path that we're going to take, because it's not about chasing this full relative motion in every circumstance. We need enough, because again, I mentioned before, like the athlete has to protect themselves from certain things, but I don't want to steal away their performance. If I have a scenario like a professional athlete that comes into IFAST or something like that, it's like, okay, I know this guy has to be able to perform. It's like, how can I give him the buffer against his natural tendencies or his trained tendencies that allows him to protect himself and still produce the desired outcome? And so I don't have like a singular KPI. It would be determined in process as to, okay, so every time we see hip internal rotation in this circumstance, I'll give you, for instance, got to evaluate a world-class 400-meter runner. And what we determined over time was that, so his hip internal rotation needs to be maintained within 15 to 20 degrees. So if he drifts too far outside of that, he can't produce force. If he drifts inside of that, he starts to feel strain, right? And so we have this kind of narrow window that we try to keep that person within. And so this is the thing that we monitor. And we say, okay, so we're going to apply these strategies in your supplementary training. You're going to have this program that you're going to be training with in context, and then we monitor those key performance indicators. So there's not like one specific that you would ever want to rely on. What you're going to find is that, if I had a baseball pitcher, I can tell you that I had one guy that he would have 135 degrees of shoulder ER and he would feel great. And then again, if he would drift away from that, then we started to see the nagging aches and pains start to show up. And so again, it would be determined in process.
It's actually a great transition point into, I'm fascinated by this idea of like, where's the line in attempting to address what is an identified movement limitation in somebody that is asymptomatic. So,
Okay.
when you have somebody that, you comes in and maybe, for just as an easy example, somebody comes in and they sit on a table and they have 5 degrees of hip internal rotation on one side. You would look at that and say, that seems to be at one extreme end of the continuum, likely in a way that is not ideal, but, because of their age or because of the way they've patterned around it, they don't have active symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
What is in the absence of pain and the absence of discomfort, how do you assess whether a limitation or a loss of relative motion is something that is worth chasing after from an intervention standpoint?
Okay, so especially when you have limitations like this and then no symptoms, then what we need to identify is the overall strategy that they're using for movement. So I'll give you for instance, as long as there is a space to move in, then people will tend to not have symptoms. So symptoms occur when we have stagnation of mechanical energy. So if I have a twist in my knee that I'm trying to absorb force from the ground, like the ground reaction force is going to move into me, right? And that's the energy that I actually use to propel myself because I store that and then I release it. But if I have an orientation of a joint that causes that energy to stagnate, and so it's hitting the same spot and reflecting in the opposite direction all the time, that will ultimately become symptomatic, or I will start to see the structural adaptation occur. However, if I could create space, so I'll give you a scenario. I don't know how valuable it's going to be because I talk funny, but if I have a scenario where I can change my thorax shape as I apply force into the ground, and I can create a turn as I apply that force into the ground, I now have created a pathway for that energy to flow through versus becoming stagnated in one spot. And so as long as I have that, then I could remain asymptomatic. However, the movement limitation would still exist. And so this is this game that you and I have to play with, especially when we're talking about high level athletes. It's like, okay, if I take this away from him, am I going to cause a problem, a structural problem, because he won't have this directional buffer that protects him from the forces that are applied. But this is part of the process. This is why we collect data over time, because we have to see, like, okay, what is the behavior that I'm recognizing? What strategy are they using as they organize their body to produce any number of outcomes? And we can do this through measurement, which is useful. But again, we need data over time to determine whether this strategy is something that we need to affect and reduce, or is this something that has to be there? And we would determine this through process. I'll give you another, for instance. If you had somebody, and I'll use traditional terms, so people can follow. If you had somebody that would be accused of having an anti-orientation of the pelvis and a hyperlordosis, right? And let's just say they had back pain. And if I could increase that lordosis beyond what they already have, I have just given them an energetic pathway to redistribute energy because I've actually increased the amount of space that they could use to move into. It's not my desired solution necessarily, but it is a solution for a symptom, right? And so this is why we have to be very, very careful when we talk about being successful. It's like, did I resolve a symptom? Yes. Okay. Did I do it in such a way that gave them an opportunity to protect themselves? Maybe not. Right. And so again, we have to be very, very careful. But this is the difference between, again, just measuring joints versus understanding the overall strategy that the system is using to behave. And this is what we want to get better at, because the more information that we have and the more understanding that we have about how all of this stuff relates to each other, we can understand that it's like, okay, so all I got to do is redirect the way that he is absorbing this energy from the ground, and I can either protect him or I can at least make him asymptomatic for the time being.
This it raises another question that we see some people in our world that are very interested in their own physical development, and they have medical professionals in their corner that they work with in the off season, and they are hyper focused on this idea of like optimizing movement. And I realize there's some dirty words in there.
It's okay.
But they're very internally focused on how they feel and things moving perfectly. And, there's a fairly compelling body of literature on skill development and execution that having more of an external focus can lead to more desirable outcomes. And, there seems to be a line there too with certain people where you need to bring enough awareness to an area that they can feel what is not moving in the way that's desirable and help them understand, how to shift and move in a certain area, but not so much that they're hyper focused on it. Have you do you have strategies in approaching that with the athletes that you work with that come in to see you that,
Yes.
Does that alarm ever go off in your head where it's like you're focused so much on this that's creating other issues?
Yeah, they end up constraining themselves in a lot of those scenarios. The thing that we have to get away from is that there is an optimal. There really isn't. What we want to do is we want to make sure that the necessary options are available. We know, I think we know pretty well that number one, we can't reproduce the exact same motion twice, which means that we always have signal and we always have noise, right? And we want to optimize that relationship. It's like, I need enough signal for the desired outcome. I need enough noise to remain adaptable. Too much noise, and then you're unstable. And so again, this is our data. This is our process to determine. It's like, okay, well, how much do we need of each of those? And we would work from there. And again, process has a lot to do with this expanding understanding of what are all the potential influences, and we'll never know all of them, but the more that we understand that we're bringing to the table can be helpful. There will always be the internal and the external, right? And it's like there are contexts where the internal becomes infinitely more important. Like when we're talking about recapturing relative motions, it's like there is sensory awareness that has to be available to allow us to do that. And this goes back to when I was talking about the state dependent responses. It's like that's very strongly an internal representation. This is the internal movement vocabulary that has to be evolved so they can sense certain things. And then when they sense certain things, they can know that they are being effective in their recapturing relative motion. When we talk about projection away from us, now we're talking about a lot more performance related types of activities, and this becomes very external in that circumstance. If there are ever situations where we need somebody to recognize something that maybe they can't sense. So this is where we use strategic loading to actually magnify the current strategy to make them aware. And so now we actually help them evolve their movement vocabulary. So for instance, it's like if I had somebody that was using a spinal compensatory strategy as a substitution for hip internal rotation. Real simple way to resolve that is do a suitcase carry, and they will sense it right away because they'll feel the asymmetrical element of load that goes through the trunk and the hip, and that allows them to recognize that. They go, oh, now I understand. But I also have evolved a KPI for myself because now I take them into a scenario where I'm using a stronger internal representation for them to recapture motion. Now we go back to the suitcase carry as my KPI, and then I can recognize that the movement is different, but they can also sense that the movement is different because now they're going to be sensing something entirely different if you're successful.
I want to wrap up here, Bill, by talking about breathing. I think that it's a topic that has certainly hit the mainstream awareness as far as, people have heard that they're supposed to be breathing using their diaphragm, which is often used interchangeably with belly breathing.
Unfortunately.
Yes. So when you're evaluating breathing, what are you looking for? And then can you talk a little bit about, the negative consequences of people hyper-focusing on this idea of belly breathing?
Boy. Okay. So here's the cool thing. True, restful, tidal breathing is also representative of the space within which we have the greatest relative motions. So if I can expand and then exhale in a relaxed manner, and I have full access to relative motion, I could measure that through the extremities. When we start to use compensatory breathing strategies, we start to recruit greater degrees of superficial musculature, which would typically be associated with moving through space versus just breathing. And so when they become accessory exhalation muscles, the increase in the concentric orientation of those muscles are actually going to constrain ranges of motion. So my extremity measures tell me right off the bat whether I have somebody that has the capacity to breathe without constraint. And so that's what I'm following as we're going through process. If our intention is to recapture relative movement, which is why breath gets superimposed over so many activities, the thing you want to recognize is that the breathing strategy that you're going to use is very contextual. right? So if I'm in the purple room and I'm working with somebody that might have a painful condition, and we're like, our total focus is on the recapture of the best representation of relative motion, we're definitely going to be superimposing a breathing behavior that's going to be associated with restoring that tidal volume. And in doing so, we immediately see the extremity ranges of motion change. Again, this goes back to our state-dependent behaviors, right? If we have a scenario where force is involved, then obviously this is going to be a much more constrained scenario, and it's going to be more of an exhalation based, because we can't produce maximum force while we inhale. And so you always know that you're gonna have somebody that's gonna be biased through that. All that said, if we would need to determine the behavior of, say, the diaphragm, there's a series of tests that you could use. One would be literally a direct measurement of the ISA behavior, which is something that you can learn very easily. There's an expansion test that you can use to let you know that you're getting the circumferential expansion of the abdominal cavity. There's a way to determine whether somebody is an extreme exhaler because they lose a residual volume and that affects their neck motion, things like that. If we would need to measure that directly. When you're talking about belly breathing, so this is the intentional expansion of the abdomen while constraining it would be like people say they're constraining their chest. It's actually you're constraining the upper thorax. That would be, I was trying to think of a time where this would be desired. And I would imagine if an elephant was sitting on your chest, then you would want to be able to belly breathe, right? Because that would give you the space to actually change pressures and take some air in. As far as like a health or performance related strategy, I wouldn't recommend it. And I can't think of a circumstance that I would recommend it because of the constraint of the thorax. Again, constraining the thorax increases the concentric orientation of superficial musculature, which is the greatest interference to our extremity ranges of motion. So I wouldn't recommend that. Is it diaphragmatic? Yes, in most circumstances. But now you have to say, it's like, okay, if the belly pooches out that far, it's like, why does it do that? Well, one of the reasons is because you're creating this top-down gradient of compression from the thorax, and you actually have to shorten the distance between the rib cage and the pelvis so that there's enough extensibility in the abdomen under that circumstance. So all you're doing is reinforcing an undesirable compressive strategy in most circumstances.
Bill, I can't thank you enough for doing this. This was awesome. Certainly gave me and everybody listening a lot to think about. Just to wrap up, where's the best place for people to connect with you and to learn from you?
The only place. How about that?
Keep it easy.
So I'm really old, as we talked about before. I'm really old. And so I have taken everything in my life and I've put it in one place. And that's the UHP network. And so they can just go to uhp.network. And that's where I do all of my work. And so, and you can join for free. There's, oh my gosh, we got free courses up there. We've got articles, we've got podcasts, we've got conference calls, all that stuff is accessible for free. And then we have, for the more ambitious, we have the plus side network where we really get in depth with a lot of the things that we were actually discussing today, and then some. And that's where I do everything. It's the easiest place to find. So it's uhp.network.
You made that easy for everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Bill. It's been great to talk.
It's great to see you.